The autumn air carried the familiar sounds of traffic and distant construction through the half-open windows of the Riverside Community Center in San Diego, California. It was October 1981, and the building buzzed with the energy of various activities happening simultaneously. The basketball courts echoed with sneakers squeaking against polished floors, while the craft room hummed with quiet conversations from the senior citizens' pottery class. In the far corner of the building, past the reception desk and down a narrow hallway lined with community bulletin boards, lay a modest room that most visitors never noticed. The wooden floors were scuffed from years of use, and fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the space. A few folding chairs sat stacked against one wall, and a small American flag hung beside a faded poster of basic karate stances. This was where Harold Yamamoto spent his Tuesday and Thursday evenings, though calling him an instructor seemed almost generous. At 62 years old, Harold was a quiet man with silver-streaked black hair and weathered hands that spoke of decades working as a mechanic. His karate gi was clean but well worn, the fabric soft from countless washings, the black belt around. His waist showed signs of age, its edges frayed but still holding the dignity of years of dedication. Harold had been teaching at the community center for 3 years, ever since his retirement from the naval shipyard. The class rarely drew more than 4 or 5 students, usually middle-aged adults looking for exercise or curious teenagers whose interest faded after a few weeks. Unlike the flashy dojos that were sprouting up across California, promising quick black belts and tournament victories, Harold taught traditional Shotokan karate the way he had learned it from his sensei in post-war Japan. Tonight, only 2 students had shown up. Margaret Chen, a 40-something accountant who attended sporadically, practiced her kata with the determined concentration of someone still struggling with the basic movements. Next to her, Tommy Rodriguez, a 17-year-old whose mother had signed him up hoping martial arts would help with his confidence, worked through his punches with the mechanical precision of someone going through the motions. Harold moved between them quietly, offering gentle corrections in his soft-spoken manner. He adjusted Margaret's stance with patient hands, demonstrating the proper hip rotation for a punch. With Tommy, he worked on breathing techniques, explaining how the martial arts were as much about the mind as the body. Neither student seemed particularly engaged, but Harold continued with the same dedication he brought to every class. The community center's director, Mrs. Patterson, occasionally peeked through the door during her evening rounds. She tolerated Harold's class more than supported it, viewing it as a minor community service that barely justified the room rental. The karate program generated little revenue compared to the popular aerobics classes or youth basketball leagues that filled other spaces. Outside the small world of the community center, karate was experiencing unprecedented popularity across America. The success of movies featuring martial arts had sparked a nationwide interest in the discipline. Professional tournaments drew thousands of spectators, and celebrity martial artists appeared on television talk shows. Magazines featured stories about the latest fighting techniques and tournament champions. Yet Harold remained largely disconnected from this commercial boom. He had no interest in promoting his classes or expanding his program. When people asked about his background, he would simply say he had studied in Japan and leave it at that. He wore no fancy patches on his gi, displayed no tournament trophies, and made no claims about special fighting systems or secret techniques. The few students who stayed with Harold's program gradually learned that their sensei possessed something different from the flashy instructors at commercial schools. His movements carried a precision and power that came from decades of practice. When he demonstrated a technique, there was an economy of motion and a quiet intensity that spoke of deep understanding. But to most people who passed by the community center, Harold Yamamoto was simply an elderly Japanese-American man who taught a small karate class to anyone willing to pay the modest monthly fee. He was polite, reliable, and forgettable. The custodial staff knew him as the quiet man who always cleaned up after his classes and never left any equipment lying around. As the evening class drew to a close, Harold led his students through the traditional closing ceremony. They knelt in Caesar position, bowed to the front of the room, and then to their sensei. Margaret and Tommy gathered their things quickly, exchanging brief pleasantries about seeing each other next week before heading out into the California night. Harold remained alone in the empty room, straightening the few pieces of equipment and turning off the lights. Tomorrow would bring another day at the community center, another small class that few people noticed or cared about. He had no way of knowing that everything was about to change, that his quiet world was about to be turned upside down by the arrival of someone who would see beyond the humble exterior to recognize what others had missed. The old trainer locked up the room and walked slowly through the empty hallways, his footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors. Outside, the lights of San Diego sparkled in the distance, and somewhere in that sprawling city, the person who would change his life was making plans to visit the Riverside Community Center. The following Tuesday evening brought an unusual energy to the Riverside Community Center. Harold Yamamoto arrived at his customary time, 5 minutes before class began, carrying his worn canvas bag with his GI neatly folded inside. The October air had grown cooler and the building's heating system hummed quietly in the background. As he unlocked the door to his practice room, Harold noticed something different. A young man sat on one of the folding chairs near the entrance, reading what appeared to be a martial arts magazine. The stranger looked to be in his mid-20s, with dark hair and a lean build that suggested athletic training. He wore simple civilian clothes, jeans and a plain white t-shirt, but there was something in his posture that caught Harold's attention. The young man looked up as Harold entered, and their eyes met briefly. There was a moment of mutual assessment, the kind that occurs when two martial artists first encounter each other. The stranger's gaze was direct but respectful, and he stood immediately when Harold appeared. "Excuse me," the young man said, his voice carrying a slight East Coast accent. "Are you the karate instructor here?" Harold nodded quietly, setting his bag down on the small table near the front of the room. "I am Harold Yamamoto. Class begins in a few minutes." "My name is David Chen," the stranger replied, extending his hand. "I was wondering if I could observe tonight's class. I'm new to San Diego, and I'm looking for a place to train." Harold shook. The offered hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of serious training. "You have experience in martial arts?" David nodded. "I studied Shotokan for 8 years back east. I hold a brown belt under Sensei Roberts in Philadelphia. I've been training since I was 14. Something in David's manner intrigued Harold. Unlike the casual students who occasionally wandered into his classes, this young man displayed the bearing of someone who understood the traditional aspects of karate training. He bowed slightly when introduced, kept his hands at his sides, and waited for permission before speaking further. "You may observe," Harold said simply, beginning to change into his GI behind a small privacy screen in the corner of the room. "We begin with basic warm-up exercises." Margaret Chen arrived next, followed closely by Tommy Rodriguez, and surprisingly, a new student Harold had never seen before. It was turning out to be an unusually busy evening for the small community center class. As Harold led the group through their opening rituals, he was aware of David's careful attention from the sidelines. The young man watched everything with the focused concentration of someone who understood what he was seeing. When Harold demonstrated basic stances, David's eyes tracked the subtle details of foot placement and body alignment that most casual observers would miss. The class proceeded with its usual pattern of basic techniques, kata practice, and light sparring drills. Harold moved among his students with his characteristic patience, offering corrections and encouragement. But throughout the evening, he found himself occasionally glancing toward David, curious about this serious young observer. During a water break halfway through the class, David approached Harold quietly. "Sensei, your maigeri technique is very clean. I can see the classical form that we sometimes lose in American schools." Harold paused, surprised by the observation. Few people, even experienced martial artists, notice the subtle differences between traditional Japanese techniques and their American adaptations. "You have a good eye," he replied simply. "I've been studying with some of the senior instructors on the East Coast," David explained. "But I've noticed that many schools here in California teach a more commercial version of karate. I'm looking for something closer to what I learned about the original teachings." Harold said nothing, but there was a slight shift in his demeanor. He resumed teaching with the same quiet intensity, but now there was an added precision to his demonstrations, as if he were revealing layers of technique that he normally kept concealed. As the class drew to a close, Harold led the students through their final exercises and the traditional closing ceremony. The other students gathered their belongings and departed with their usual casual farewells, but David remained seated, waiting patiently. When they were alone, David stood and bowed formally to Harold. "Thank you for allowing me to observe, Sensei. I would very much like to train with you, if you would accept me as a student." Harold studied the young man carefully. There was something in David's bearing that reminded him of the serious students he had known decades earlier, the ones who came to martial arts seeking more than just physical exercise or social activity. "You understand that this is not a commercial school," Harold said quietly. "We do not train for tournaments or trophies. The focus is on traditional technique and personal development." "That's exactly what I'm looking for," David replied. "I've been training in competition-style karate for years, but I want to understand the deeper aspects of the art, the way it was originally taught." Harold was quiet for a long moment, considering. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. You may join the class. We train Tuesday and Thursday evenings. The fee is $20 per month." As David thanked him and prepared to leave, Harold had the distinct feeling that something significant had just occurred. For the first time in years, he had encountered a student who might truly understand what he had to offer. David Chen's first official training session at the Riverside Community Center began on a Thursday evening in late October. The Santa Ana winds had been blowing through Southern California for 2 days, leaving the air dry and electric with tension. Harold arrived to find David already waiting outside the practice room, sitting quietly with perfect posture and reading a book about traditional Japanese martial arts philosophy. When Harold unlocked the door, David stood and bowed properly before entering. This small gesture immediately set him apart from the casual students who typically wandered in and out of the program. Harold noted the young man's respectful approach and felt a flicker of something he had not experienced in years, genuine anticipation for what a student might bring to the training. "Tonight we begin with Kihon," Harold announced once the small group had assembled. Margaret and Tommy were present, along with a newcomer named Robert, a college student who had heard about the class from a friend. David took his place at the back of the group, observing carefully as Harold began the warm-up exercises. Traditional Shotokan training always started with basics, and Harold approached this foundation with the methodical precision that had been drilled into him decades earlier. They began with stance work, moving through Zenkutsu-dachi, Kokutsu-dachi, and Kiba-dachi. Harold demonstrated each position with the deep, stable form that characterized classical karate training. As the class progressed through basic punching techniques, Harold noticed David's movements carried a different quality than the other students. While Margaret struggled with the coordination between hip rotation and arm extension, and Tommy performed the techniques with mechanical repetition, David's punches flowed with an understanding of the underlying principles. During a brief rest period, Harold approached David quietly. "Your Gyakuzuki shows good understanding of the hip drive," he observed, "but I see some tension in your shoulders that limits the power transfer." David nodded gratefully. "My previous sensei emphasized speed over relaxation. I've been trying to unlearn some bad habits." Harold demonstrated the technique slowly, showing how the shoulders should remain relaxed until the moment of impact, then snap into alignment for maximum power transmission. The body must be like water until the instant of contact, then it becomes steel. This was a fundamental principle of traditional Shotokan that many American schools had abandoned in favor of more athletic, muscular approaches to karate. Harold watched as David attempted to implement the correction, seeing the young man's genuine effort to understand rather than simply mimic the movement. As they moved into kata practice, Harold selected Heian Shoden, the first form that all Shotokan students must master. The other students performed it with varying degrees of competence, but David's execution revealed both strengths and weaknesses that intrigued Harold. The young man clearly knew the sequence of movements, but his interpretation showed the influence of sport-oriented training. His stances were slightly higher than traditional form required, and his timing reflected the rapid-fire pace of tournament competition, rather than the measured, powerful rhythm of classical kata. Harold worked with each student individually, But he found himself spending extra time with David, making subtle adjustments to stance depth and timing. Kata is not about speed, he explained quietly. It is about understanding the application of each technique. Every movement has meaning. During the final portion of class, Harold introduced basic kumite drills. Traditional Shotokan sparring in the early 1980s emphasized controlled, focused techniques rather than the continuous fighting that was becoming popular in tournament circuits. Students practiced one-step sparring, where the attacker would throw a single technique and the defender would respond with a predetermined counterattack. David's sparring revealed the same pattern Harold had observed in his kata. The young man possessed good technical knowledge and athletic ability, but his approach showed the influence of competition-focused training. His timing was rushed, and he seemed uncomfortable with the measured, formal pace of traditional kumite. After class, as the other students gathered their belongings and departed, David remained behind to speak with Harold. "Sensei, I can see that what you teach is different from what I learned back east. More traditional." Harold nodded, beginning to fold his gi with the precise movements he brought to everything he did. American karate has evolved to emphasize different aspects of the art. Competition, athletics, quick results. These are not necessarily wrong, but they are not the only way. What I learned focused mainly on winning tournaments, David admitted. But I always felt like something was missing. The philosophical aspects, the deeper meaning that the old masters wrote about. "True karate cannot be learned quickly," Harold replied. "It requires years of repetition, of studying the same techniques over and over, until the body understands what the mind cannot explain. Most American students do not have patience for this approach." David was quiet for a moment, considering Harold's words. Outside, the Santa Ana winds rattled the windows of the community center, and the sound of traffic drifted through the building. "I want to learn the traditional way," he said finally, "even if it takes longer." Harold studied the young man's face, seeing something in his expression that reminded him of his own dedication when he had first begun training seriously. "Very well, but you must understand that this will require unlearning much of what you have been taught. Are you prepared for that challenge?" David nodded without hesitation. "Yes, Sensei. I am ready to start over, if necessary." As they locked up the practice room and walked through the empty corridors of the community center, Harold felt a sense of possibility that he had not experienced in years. Perhaps finally he had found a student who might truly appreciate what traditional karate had to offer. The weeks that followed marked a gradual transformation in Harold's small karate program. Word had somehow spread about the quiet Japanese-American instructor who taught traditional Shotokan at the Riverside Community Center, and by mid-November, the class had grown to 8 regular students. Most significantly, Harold noticed that the new arrivals possessed a different attitude than his previous casual students. David Chen had become the unofficial leader among the students, not through any formal appointment, but through his dedicated approach to training and his obvious respect for Harold's teachings. The young man arrived early for every class, spent time practicing kata movements before instruction began, and stayed afterward to work on techniques that challenged him. On this particular Tuesday evening, Harold decided to introduce the class to makiwara training, a traditional conditioning method that most American karate schools had abandoned in favor of modern punching bags. He had constructed a simple makiwara from a flexible piece of oak attached to a post behind the community center, wrapped with rope and canvas. Traditional training emphasized conditioning the body as well as learning technique, Harold explained as the students gathered around the humble training device. The makiwara teaches proper form, timing, and gradually strengthens the striking surfaces. Margaret looked skeptical. "Isn't this kind of old-fashioned? Most schools use heavy bags now." Harold demonstrated a series of punches against the makiwara, each strike producing a sharp snapping sound as the board flexed and returned to position. His technique was flawless, the result of decades of traditional training. Heavy. Bags teach power, but they do not teach precision. The makiwara responds to correct technique with good timing. Poor technique is immediately obvious. David stepped forward first when Harold invited the students to try. His initial attempts were hesitant, clearly influenced by his previous training with modern equipment. The makiwara's response was irregular, sometimes barely moving, other times vibrating wildly from incorrect contact. "Relax your shoulder," Harold instructed quietly, adjusting David's stance slightly. "The power comes from the entire body, not just the arm. Feel the connection from your foot through your hip to your fist. As David worked to implement the corrections, Harold moved among the other students, offering individual guidance. He was particularly patient with Tommy Rodriguez, who had struggled with confidence issues since joining the class. The Makiwara training seemed to help Tommy focus on technique rather than worrying about hurting a partner or being hurt. During a water break, Robert, the college student, approached Harold with a question that revealed the growing seriousness of the group. "Sensei, I've been reading about the philosophical aspects of karate training. Are we going to study that as well?" Harold paused, considering his response carefully. In his early years teaching at the community center, students had rarely shown interest in anything beyond the physical techniques. Traditional karate training includes study of the mental and spiritual aspects. But these cannot be taught like techniques. They must be experienced through correct practice over time. "What do you mean by correct practice?" David asked, joining the conversation. "Each technique, each kata, each moment of training contains lessons about patience, persistence, humility, and self-control," Harold explained. "But these lessons reveal themselves only to students who approach training with the proper attitude." As the class resumed, Harold introduced Ippon Kumite, the one-step sparring that was fundamental to traditional Shotokan training. Unlike the continuous fighting popular in sport karate, Ippon Kumite emphasized perfect technique, proper distance, and decisive execution. The exercise required one student to attack with a predetermined technique, while the partner blocked and counterattacked with equal precision. Success was measured not by speed or aggression, but by the technical excellence and control displayed by both participants. David partnered with Robert for the drill, and Harold watched their interaction with growing interest. Both young men showed genuine concern for their partner's safety while maintaining the intensity necessary for effective training. This balance between courtesy and martial spirit was central to traditional karate philosophy. As the students worked through the Ippon Kumite sequences, Harold noticed something that pleased him greatly. The newer students were learning not just from his instruction, but from watching David and the others who had embraced the traditional approach. A culture of serious training was developing within the small group. Margaret, who had initially been resistant to some of the traditional methods, found herself drawn into the disciplined atmosphere. Her kata had improved dramatically as she began to understand that each movement had fighting applications and philosophical meaning beyond mere exercise. During the final meditation period that Harold had recently introduced, the practice room fell into a silence that would have been impossible with his earlier, more casual students. 8 adults sat in perfect Caesar position, breathing slowly and deeply, allowing their minds to process the evening's training. After class, as the students gathered their belongings, Harold overheard a conversation that confirmed his growing sense that something special was happening with this group. David was explaining to one of the newer students why they bowed not just to Harold, but to each other and to the practice space itself. "It's about respect for the art and everyone involved in preserving it," David said quietly. "Sensei Yamamoto represents a direct connection to the traditional masters who developed these techniques. When we bow to him, we're acknowledging that lineage." Harold felt a warmth in his chest that he had not experienced in years. For the first time since beginning to teach at the community center, he had students who truly understood what traditional karate was meant to accomplish. They were not just learning to fight or getting exercise. They were participating in the transmission of a cultural and philosophical tradition that stretched back centuries. As he locked up the practice room and walked through the quiet corridors of the community center, Harold allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic about the future of his small program. Perhaps traditional karate could find a place in modern America after all. December brought the first real test for Harold's growing program. Word of the quiet instructor at the Riverside Community Center had reached the ears of Jake Morrison, owner of the largest commercial karate school in San Diego. Morrison's American Fighting Systems School occupied a modern facility complete with mirrored walls, professional lighting, and a prominent display of tournament trophies. Harold learned of Morrison's interest through David, who had encountered the commercial instructor at a local sporting goods store. Morrison had been asking questions about the old Japanese guy who was supposedly teaching traditional Shotokan, expressing skepticism about anyone operating such a low-profile program. "He wants to visit the class," David reported after Tuesday evening training. "He said he's curious about what we're doing here." Harold considered this news quietly as he folded his GI. He had encountered instructors like Morrison before, entrepreneurs who had transformed martial arts into profitable businesses by emphasizing quick advancement, flashy techniques, and tournament success. Such instructors often viewed traditional approaches as outdated obstacles to commercial growth. "What did you tell him?" Harold asked. "I said he was welcome to observe, like any visitor. But I thought you should know he's coming." David paused. "Sensei, I should probably mention that several of us have friends who train at his school. They've been asking questions about what we do here." Harold nodded thoughtfully. The growing attention was inevitable, he supposed. His students had been improving rapidly under traditional training methods, and their progress was becoming noticeable to others in the local martial arts community. The following Thursday, Jake Morrison arrived precisely at class time, accompanied by two of his advanced students. Morrison was a man in his early 40s, powerfully built, wearing an expensive gi with numerous patches advertising his school and achievements. His black belt was pristine, clearly newer than Harold's worn and faded one. Harold greeted Morrison with the same quiet courtesy he showed all visitors, inviting him to observe from the side of the room. Morrison's students, both wearing brown belts, settled beside their instructor with the confident bearing of successful tournament competitors. The evening's class proceeded with Harold's usual format: Kihon basics, kata practice, and traditional kumite drills. Harold was aware of Morrison's scrutinizing attention, but he maintained his customary teaching approach without modification or showmanship. During Kihon practice, Harold's students demonstrated the deep stances and powerful techniques that characterize traditional Shotokan training. Their movements were slower and more deliberate than the rapid-fire combinations popular in sport karate, but each technique carried obvious power and precision. Morrison leaned forward when David performed the kata basai dai, his execution showing the influence of months under Harold's traditional instruction. The young man's stances were deeper than contemporary sport kata typically required, his timing more measured, his focus more intense. "Interesting interpretation," Morrison commented quietly to Harold during a brief rest period. "Very old-school style." Harold simply nodded, offering no explanation or defense of his methods. The real test came during kumite practice. Harold's students engaged in traditional ippon kumite, emphasizing perfect technique, proper distance, and decisive execution. Each exchange was conducted with formal courtesy, precise technique, and complete control. Morrison's students watched with obvious interest, occasionally exchanging glances that suggested they found the formal approach unusual. Their own training clearly emphasized continuous sparring and athletic competition rather than the measured, traditional methods they were observing. After class concluded with the formal closing ceremony, Morrison approached Harold directly. "You've got some dedicated students here," he said, his tone neutral but professional. "I'm curious about your background. Where did you train?" "I studied in Japan for several years after the war," Harold replied simply. "My sensei emphasized traditional methods. Individual kata competition in traditional categories. No modernized interpretations or musical accompaniment. The judging would be based on classical Shotokan standards. Proper stance depth, correct timing, authentic technique," David explained. Several students have expressed interest in competing. As the class assembled for training, Harold noticed the anticipatory atmosphere among his students. Word of the tournament invitation had spread, and he could sense their excitement about the possibility of demonstrating their traditional skills publicly. Margaret Chen had progressed remarkably under Harold's guidance, her kata now displaying the deep stances and powerful techniques that characterized authentic Shotokan training. Tommy Rodriguez had gained confidence through traditional methods, his natural athleticism finally channeled through proper form and philosophical understanding. Robert, the college student, had become particularly devoted to kata practice, spending extra hours perfecting the movements of Teki Shodan and Basai Dai. Even the newer students showed dedication that impressed. Harold, their training reflected genuine respect for traditional methods rather than casual interest in martial arts exercise. During the evening's kata practice, Harold observed his students with fresh perspective. Their movements carried the characteristics he had worked so hard to develop. Deep stances that demonstrated leg strength and stability, techniques executed with proper timing and power, and most importantly, the focused intensity that distinguished traditional karate from athletic performance. Your kata has improved significantly, Harold acknowledged as the students concluded their practice of Heian Yondan. The question is whether public demonstration serves the goals of traditional training. David stepped forward respectfully. Sensei, we understand that tournaments can corrupt training if they become the primary focus. But this particular competition seems designed to honor traditional methods rather than exploit them. Harold considered his students' words carefully. He had spent years protecting his small program from the commercial pressures that had transformed much of American karate. But perhaps the time had come to demonstrate that traditional methods could not only survive but excel within the broader martial arts community. Traditional kata competition requires more than technical correctness, Harold explained to the group. Judges look for understanding of bunkai, the fighting applications embedded in each movement. They observe breathing, focus, and the mental state that accompanies proper execution. Margaret raised her hand tentatively. Would participating in this tournament change our training methods here? Would we need to modify our approach for competition preparation? Harold shook his head firmly. Traditional training does not change for external purposes. If our methods are correct, they will demonstrate their value without modification. If they are insufficient, then we must continue developing our understanding. The evening concluded with Harold's decision to allow interested students to participate in the tournament, but with strict conditions. Their preparation would occur during regular class time using standard training methods. No special coaching or tournament-specific modifications would be introduced. This competition will serve as a test, Harold announced as the students prepared to leave. Not a test of whether we can win trophies, but a test of whether traditional training methods develop the kind of understanding that remains strong under pressure. As the students departed, Harold reflected on the decision he had made. For the first time in years, his traditional karate program would be exposed to public scrutiny. The competition would reveal whether his students had truly absorbed the principles he had worked so hard to transmit. David remained behind as always, helping Harold organize the practice equipment. Sensei, are you concerned about how we will perform against other traditional schools? Harold folded his GI with characteristic precision. Competition reveals truth. If our training has been correct, it will be evident. If there are deficiencies, we will learn from them and continue improving. The tournament was still 2 months away, but Harold knew that the decision to participate had already changed something fundamental about his program. The quiet isolation that had protected his traditional methods was about to end, and the results would determine the future direction of everything he had built. The Southern California Traditional Karate Championships took place on a warm Saturday in May 1982 at the Fullerton Community College Gymnasium. Harold arrived with 6 of his students, each carrying their carefully folded gis and a quiet determination that reflected months of traditional training. The gymnasium buzzed with activity as competitors from across the region prepared for the day's events. Harold observed the various schools represented, noting the mixture of traditional and modernized approaches that characterized the American karate landscape of the early 1980s. David Chen stood near the registration table, reviewing the competition categories with Margaret and Tommy. Their nervous energy was palpable, but Harold noticed they maintained the respectful composure that had become characteristic of his students. Sensei, the individual kata competition is divided by rank and age, David reported. Traditional forms only, judged by senior instructors from established schools. No musical accompaniment or theatrical elements allowed. Harold nodded, pleased that the tournament organizers had maintained authentic standards. He had been concerned that even events labeled as traditional might compromise classical principles to accommodate American preferences for entertainment value. As they moved through the warm-up area, Harold's students attracted subtle attention from competitors and spectators. Their deep stances and powerful techniques stood out among the more athletic, tournament-oriented styles that dominated most California competitions. Margaret Chen was scheduled to compete first, performing Heian Naiden in the intermediate women's division. Harold watched from the sideline as she took position on the competition floor, surrounded by judges who represented decades of traditional training experience. When Margaret began her kata, Harold felt a surge of pride mixed with apprehension. Her performance reflected everything he had worked to develop in his students. Deep, stable stances, techniques executed with proper timing and power, and the focused intensity that distinguished traditional karate from mere athletic performance. The judges observed Margaret's performance with evident interest, making notes as she moved through the precise sequences of Hei and Nidan. Her interpretation followed classical Shotokan standards exactly as Harold had taught them, without modern modifications or stylistic innovations. Tommy Rodriguez followed with Heian Shodan in the novice men's division. The young man who had struggled with confidence during his early months of training now demonstrated the quiet strength that traditional methods had developed within him. His kata carried authority and understanding that impressed the judging panel. David Chen's performance of Basai, Dai in the advanced division represented the culmination of his transformation from sport-oriented competitor to traditional practitioner. His execution displayed the deep understanding that could only result from months of patient, fundamental training under Harold's guidance. During the lunch break, Harold overheard conversations among other instructors that revealed the impact his students were making. Several senior teachers approached him to discuss his training methods, expressing curiosity about the traditional approach that produced such technically excellent performances. Your students show remarkable consistency in their basic technique, observed Sensei Williams from Orange County. The stances are deeper than we typically see in American competition, and the timing follows classical patterns very precisely. Harold acknowledged the compliment quietly, understanding that his program was being evaluated not just by the competition results, but by the overall quality and authenticity of his students' training. When the individual kata results were announced, Harold felt a complex mixture of emotions. Margaret placed second in her division. Tommy won first place in novice men's, and David earned third in the competitive advanced category. More importantly, all three had performed with the dignity and technical excellence that reflected true understanding of traditional principles. As they prepared to leave the gymnasium, Harold was approached by the tournament director, a senior instructor who had studied in Japan during the 1960s. Mr. Yamamoto, I wanted to personally thank you for bringing your students today. It's rare to see such authentic traditional training in American competition. The drive back to San Diego was quiet, with Harold's students processing their experience of representing traditional karate in public competition. They had demonstrated that authentic training methods could succeed within the broader martial arts community without compromising their fundamental principles. David finally broke the silence as they neared the community center. Sensei, today showed me that traditional training isn't separate from the martial arts world. It's actually the foundation that makes everything else meaningful. Harold nodded, understanding that the tournament had served its intended purpose. His students had tested their traditional training under pressure and discovered that authentic methods produced results that earned respect from serious practitioners. As they unloaded their equipment at the Riverside Community Center, Harold reflected on the day's significance. For the first time since beginning to teach in America, he had successfully demonstrated that traditional karate could thrive without compromise, earning recognition through excellence rather than accommodation to popular trends. The weeks following, the Southern California Traditional Karate Championships brought unexpected consequences for Harold's program. Word of his students' impressive performances had spread throughout the regional martial arts community, and the quiet instructor at the Riverside Community Center suddenly found himself in demand. Phone calls came daily from prospective students, many of them experienced martial artists seeking traditional training methods that had become increasingly rare in American karate schools. Harold's Tuesday and Thursday evening classes were now filled to capacity, with a waiting list of serious applicants. More significantly, Harold received a formal invitation that represented recognition he had never sought. The International Traditional Karate Federation was organizing a regional seminar featuring senior instructors who maintained authentic classical methods, and they wanted Harold to serve as one of the featured teachers. David Chen arrived for Tuesday evening training carrying a manila envelope containing the official invitation documents. Sensei, they want you to teach traditional kata and kumite applications to black belt instructors from across California. The seminar is scheduled for next month in Los Angeles. Harold examined the invitation carefully, noting the names of other instructors who would be participating. These were men he recognized by reputation, masters who had trained directly with the original Japanese instructors who brought karate to America after World War II. This is quite an honor, Margaret observed as Harold shared the invitation with the class. It means the karate community recognizes what we've been learning here. Harold set the documents aside and began the evening's training with his customary focus on fundamentals. But as his students moved through their Kihon exercises, he found himself reflecting on the path that had led to this moment of recognition. 3 years earlier, he had been teaching a handful of casual students in an overlooked room at the community center. Now his program had become a destination for serious practitioners seeking authentic traditional training, and he was being invited to share his knowledge with senior instructors from established schools. During kata practice, Harold observed his students with a mixture of pride and concern. Their technical development was undeniable. Deep stances, powerful techniques, proper timing, and the focused intensity that characterized traditional Shotokan training. But he wondered whether success and recognition might corrupt the humble spirit that had made their progress possible. David's performance of Kanku Dai demonstrated the transformation that dedicated traditional training could accomplish. The young man who had arrived seeking something beyond sport karate had developed into a practitioner whose understanding reflected years of patient, fundamental practice. Margaret's execution of Basai Dai showed similar development. The accountant who had initially struggled with basic coordination now moved with the confidence and power that came from proper traditional training methods. During kumite practice, Harold introduced advanced applications that he had not shared before. Techniques that required the foundation of understanding his students had gradually developed. These were the kind of practical fighting methods that traditional kata was designed to preserve and transmit. In traditional training, kata and kumite are not separate subjects, Harold explained as his students worked through bunkai applications. Every movement in kata contains fighting techniques. Every kumite drill develops understanding that improves kata performance. After class, as his students gathered their equipment, Harold made a decision that surprised even himself. I have decided to accept the invitation to teach at the Los Angeles seminar. This will give me an opportunity to demonstrate that traditional methods can thrive in modern America. David stepped forward with obvious concern. Sensei, will this change our training here? Will you have time to continue teaching regular classes if you become involved in these larger events? Harold understood his students' worry. Many traditional instructors who gained recognition in the American martial arts community eventually abandoned their small programs in favor of more prominent positions at established schools or commercial ventures. Our training here will continue exactly as before, Harold assured the group. This seminar is an opportunity to share traditional methods with other instructors, not to change what we do. The principles that guided our development will remain the same. As he locked up the practice room and walked through the empty corridors of the community center, Harold felt the weight of responsibility that came with recognition. He had successfully demonstrated that traditional karate could not only survive, but excel in contemporary America. But success brought new challenges. The humble community center room that had sheltered his traditional training program was no longer invisible. The quiet instructor who had taught a handful of students with patient dedication was now being recognized as a master worthy of teaching other masters. Harold understood that everything was about to change once again. But this time the changes would test whether traditional principles could remain intact under the pressures of success and public recognition. The real challenge was just beginning. The Los Angeles seminar took place at the University of Southern California campus on a crisp Saturday morning in June 1982. Harold arrived at the gymnasium to find more than 60 black belt instructors from across California, Nevada, and Arizona, all gathered to study traditional karate methods with the masters, who had preserved authentic techniques through decades of American commercialization. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation and mutual respect. These were serious martial artists who had sought out traditional training, despite the popularity of sport-oriented approaches that dominated American karate schools. They had come to learn from instructors like Harold, who maintained direct connections to the classical methods. David Chen accompanied Harold as his designated assistant, a role that honored the young man's dedicated development under traditional training. As they entered the gymnasium, Harold noticed several instructors he recognized from tournaments and demonstrations, men whose reputations were built on preserving authentic karate principles. The seminar began with formal introductions led by Sensei Williams, the tournament director who had first recognized Harold's traditional approach at the Southern California Championships. Today, we have the privilege of studying with instructors who represent the direct transmission of classical Shotokan methods from Japan to America, he announced. Harold was introduced as the third presenter. Following two senior masters, who had trained directly with the original Japanese instructors who brought karate to America in the 1950s. The weight of this recognition was not lost on him. He was being acknowledged as a keeper of traditional knowledge worthy of teaching other masters. When Harold's session began, he faced a room full of experienced black belts who possessed years of training and teaching experience. But as he began demonstrating classical kumite applications, the room fell into the focused silence that indicated genuine learning was taking place. Traditional Shotokan kata contains the complete fighting system, Harold explained as he worked through bunkai applications with David. Every movement has practical meaning, but these applications are revealed only through years of correct practice and proper understanding. He demonstrated techniques from Heian Nidan that most American instructors had never seen, showing how simple kata movements contain sophisticated fighting methods when properly understood. The applications were devastating in their effectiveness, yet required the precise timing and body mechanics that only traditional training could develop. During the question period, Harold faced inquiries that revealed the depth of knowledge present in the room. These were not casual students seeking quick techniques, but serious practitioners who understood the philosophical foundations that made traditional training effective.